Welcome everyone to the second day of our live 3-day online World Teachers Day conference. My name is Kim Beadle and I work for British Council on our Global Teaching Excellence team. For those of you who joined us yesterday, welcome back. And if this is your first day, then welcome. So this year our theme is Global Voices Future Focus. And we have plenty of sessions still to come today and tomorrow. But this morning's sessions focus on multilingualism in the classroom. So if you're joining us on Zoom, welcome. And I can see you're telling us in the chat where you're from. So lots of different places I can see there. Barcelona, right across the world. Barcelona, that's near where I am. And so as we're talking about multilingualism, perhaps you could drop the languages that you know in the chat as well, that you know or use. And if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, then welcome to you as well. And please do leave your comments there. So, for example, I'm based in Spain and I have, in my language journey, I have English, Welsh, French, Spanish, and Catalan. I don't speak all of them fluently, but to varying degrees of proficiency. I can see a lot of other languages, Persian and English, lots of Russian, Dutch, an array, many of those there. And so we're starting today with a discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined by Yiviri, my colleague. Yiviri, where are you joining us from, and what languages are you in your journey?
Hi, Kim. Hi, everyone. So I'm joining you this morning from Birmingham. And I think I speak a couple of languages. I speak English, I speak French, and I also speak Lamto, which is my mother tongue. And then I speak a couple of local languages in Cameroon, but I'm not very fluent in them. Yeah.
It is. As long as having enough to communicate with things. And that's, I think that's what we're seeing, and what we're seeing in the chat is everyone's got so many languages that they're bringing into, that they're using to for various reasons and places. So we hope to be joined by a couple of other colleagues in a bit, but we're going to get started with some questions for Yiviri. So Yiviri, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your background and your interest in this area?
Okay, thank you very much, Kim. I would like to say that multilingualism in the classroom is something that I hold so dear to me because I come from a very highly linguistically diverse context from Cameroon. And I think we have at least 280 local languages in Cameroon. And then alongside those local languages, we have English and French, which are the official languages in Cameroon, and they are languages of instruction. So you see in Cameroon, every Cameroonian would be able to speak at least 2 languages. And so I grew up in a context where just my language was spoken, and I never had access to English until when I attended school for my first time. But it was a context where teaching had to be done only in English, so any other language wasn't allowed in the classroom. And myself, just like many of my classmates, were frustrated because you had to learn in an unfamiliar language, and we struggled a lot. And so in my journey as a language teacher, I really got passionate about multilingual approaches, advocating for the integration of other languages to support students in their language learning journeys.
Yeah, fantastic. And you mentioned the multilingual approaches, which is what our topic is today. Why are we now talking about, what's the importance now of bringing in multilingual approaches into the classroom and language learning in particular?
Yeah, so multilingualism is now the norm. It isn't an exception. We have very few classrooms that are monolingual all over the world. I think classes almost all over the world are becoming really multilingual. And so there is need for us to make sure that classrooms reflect our communities. Because if we live in multilingual communities and we insist on having monolingual classrooms, then there is going to be that disconnect between the classroom and the communities from where our learners come from. And it is therefore very important that we align our teaching practices with what happens in our communities. And then, rejecting our students' languages from the classroom, asking them to keep their languages at the gate before they get into the school is some kind of linguistic injustice. Because when we reject their languages, we are rejecting their cultures, we are rejecting their identities, and we want them to form new identities in their classroom. And this, results in some kind of frustration because learners have got to adopt new identities, which is not really who they are. So it is important that we adopt inclusive language practices that allows learners to feel that they are valued, their languages are valued, their cultures are valued. And this way, they would be able to take risks, in their language learning journeys, knowing that whatever they say in whatever language is also considered as useful. Um, so these are some of the reasons why it is important for us to now think about multilingualism in our classrooms, not just in English language teaching, but in education as a whole.
Yeah, because there has been a shift, hasn't there? Particularly in language learning. We had the monolingual approach, which dominated for so long,
Yes.
and so it's suddenly now great to see this. There's a growing trend and a focus on it, and now an understanding of actually it's useful and it's, as you said, it's social justice. It's inclusive to not exclude learners' languages from the classroom. It doesn't make any sense. We naturally draw from our own languages. I know in my experience learning Catalan, I'm using Spanish and French. I'm doing translation from Spanish and French and English to help me, learn Catalan. So as a teacher, as a language teacher and also a language learner, I've used it myself. Have you also used your other languages to help you learn any new ones?
Yeah, yes, I have. I do use, like I mentioned earlier, I teach in Cameroon and we've got so many languages. And I would say I've never had a classroom where my students with just one language. No, in my classrooms, I would have students from different linguistic backgrounds, 3, 4, or 5 languages, and then we would have a dominant language. If I teach English to French-speaking Cameroonians, we would have a dominant language, which is French. And so from time to time, I have to draw from French or from the students' languages to support them in their learning. It could be completing collaborative tasks. It could be in just maybe helping them to understand a vocabulary item.
Fantastic. And I see we're joined by Adri. Hello, Adri. Welcome. Nice to see you. So
Hello, hello.
Hi, glad you could make it. We're talking about we've just been talking a little bit about multilingual in the classroom, why it's important, and talking also about how we've used other languages to help us know. Would you like to just quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I'm Adrienn Slapek. I go by Audrey. I've been teaching in the ELT, EAL scene for about 15 years. Have been in Malaysia for 11 years and currently work as head of EAL in an international school. So I work with elementary learners from the ages of about 5 to about 11 in a context where they're new to English most of the time, quite new to English, and they're learning the language of English while they are also learning subjects through that language.
We were touching a bit, Yiviri was mentioning about the sort of the benefits and why we've taken this shift from a sort of a monolingual and why it's important now to use multilingual approaches in the classroom. Are there any sort of background or reasons why we're now seeing this shift, which is good?
Well, in Southeast Asia, where I'm based, there's been a massive proliferation of international schools. And so access to those has definitely shifted the landscape. So 11 years ago, when I came here, there were many, many English language centers. So more like, teaching English as a second or foreign language alongside school. Whereas now what we're seeing is that more and more parents are choosing to send their children to international schools so that they are learning the language and also learning through that language. So that's definitely changed the landscape. And also Southeast Asian countries tend to be multilingual. So people here speak more than one language. I think maybe it's just shifted in terms of, having more access to the home languages of these children as well has been, obviously research has shown that that's really useful for their learning, all aspects of their learning really. And maybe parents having more understanding of that is also changing the way that they decide to, how they make decisions about their children's education really.
Yeah, so it's obviously it's a really growing area, and we've sort of talked about some of the benefits and reasons why we are now talking about using multilingual approaches. But I might ask you both: have you sort of say that, are there any sort of challenges perhaps or barriers to using multilingual practices? And I'm going to ask the audience as well. Perhaps you can put in the chat or in the comments maybe challenges that you might think you've come across from taking a multilingual approach in your context. So involved there. So I'll pass go. Adri, would you like to start?
Sure. Yes, definitely. I mean, as a teacher, it can feel really isolating when you have children in your classroom whose home languages you don't speak. And perhaps if there are like more of them, then they might be speaking a language, in groups, and it's really hard for you to then not know what they're talking about. So this kind of like trust that you have to put in the process is difficult, and that transition for teachers can be quite tricky. And then, the loss of control, or the feeling of this loss of control, can really throw people. And I've certainly been in classrooms of my own creation where I was like, wow, so many languages being spoken. I wonder if they are still on task. So that can be really scary. I also think that there is a really big part here about like educating the parents or educating the adults, the key stakeholders. So whether that's senior leadership in the school where you work, whether that's the parent community, or if you're working with adults, even, them, and shifting the mindset of like, this view of like language interference, moving them on to actually like translanguaging and leveraging the linguistic repertoire of the person that you're working with, and how that can unlock access to other aspects of learning, which is really important in the context where I work in, where we need to know whether a child has any knowledge of the topics that we are trying to teach to them through English. So yeah, these are all aspects that can cause difficulties, and just need careful consideration, really. And also the moving people's perceptions from the looking at how a child is learning English. A lot of people are looking at what they don't know yet, and then moving on to looking at more like an asset view of like, yes, but they are able to use more than one language to express how they are feeling, for instance, is a win.
Yeah, and you mentioned sort of parental involvement there, and I can see a few comments in the chat about that. Aida sort of saying it's very important to involve the parents and the key stakeholders who might be potentially a little resistant or maybe not sure about it because that's their maybe their own preferences for learning or what their ideas or what they're used to essentially. Another point you mentioned there is about having different languages, and again that's coming through in the chat. Marika says she has 40 different languages in her classroom, and so I think a big question is, and it often comes up in this, is can we use other languages when we, teacher and learners don't share that? It really can we?
Um, I think it's a big yes for me, Kim. The teacher does not necessarily need to be multilingual to practice multilingualism in their classroom. I think what the teacher needs is a multilingual mindset and skill set. The first thing that the teacher wants to do, for example, would be to establish a classroom culture, classroom norms that explicitly value multilingualism in the classroom. And when this is done, learners feel comfortable in using other languages in the classroom. And one other important thing is when we talk about using other languages, it doesn't mean that a subject should be taught just in that language, or that English should be taught in French or in Spanish or in Lamto, which is my mother tongue. No, but the teacher should be able to make informed decisions when they can use the other language to support their learners. So it is not necessary for the teacher to be multilingual. Another point which I would like to emphasize about the teacher not sharing the same language with learners is that the teacher in the classroom is just a facilitator. The teacher does not want to take up the role of being the only language expert. No, the students are also experts in the other languages that they bring to the classroom. And so if the teacher assumes this facilitator role, it means that he or she would be open, to learn the other languages that the students bring to the classroom. And the aspect of the teacher showing interest in learning the students' language is very important. You want to learn their languages. You want to demonstrate that you can also make mistakes in their languages, give them the opportunity to correct you. And then they also feel powerful. They feel, oh, I know what my teacher doesn't know, so I can also take the risk to speak in English. If I make mistakes, after all, my teacher also makes mistakes when he tries to speak my language. Then you see, there is that, you strike that balance, and your students feel really comfortable when they are learning the language. The teacher can also leverage on peer support. You may want to give a group work to a student. Although you do not understand the languages that the students bring to class, you can do a strategic peer grouping according to languages that the students speak. Maybe there are students who speak Spanish. You can put them in their group, and others who speak French, others who speak whichever languages. They can collaborate, they can generate their ideas, they can co-construct knowledge using the language because it is important to say that learning is about making meaning. And meaning making is not just by using English. Learners have to, first of all, co-construct knowledge, brainstorm, put their ideas together, and then later on, they could either transliterate or translate these ideas into tasks, into essays, into classroom presentation. So the teachers are not necessarily supposed to be multilingual in order to practice multilingualism in their classrooms.
Yeah, thank you, Yiviri. And we had like there's your use of the word facilitator there, and Victoria actually commented on that in the chat as well. The point is you're not having to use the learners' languages yourselves, but actually facilitating how learners are able to draw from their own languages, developing that metacognitive awareness of how they can use and leverage languages to help them with learning. And you touched on a few nice sort of ideas there, because there was a couple of questions about, but how do we do it? How does the teacher do it? And you talked about using peer support and a few other ideas. So perhaps let's move on to sort of more then sort of practical tips. You gave us some there, Yiviri. So how, as teachers, then sort of some more examples of how teachers and learners, of course, might use their other languages to help them learn in the classroom. Adrienn, would you like to add a few?
Sure. It's interesting. So I've just come from some parent-teacher conferences here, and had to talk to parents about how do we actually work with the languages in the classroom. And one thing that I think parents often underestimate is actually the power of just, reading at home with your children in their home language about the topics that they are learning in school is really, really powerful, because then say we're learning about the Stone Age and I have all this vocabulary that I have to pre-teach. If the child knows all that language or some of that language already in their home language and they are quite secure in it, then we can draw on that in the classroom, and even just like really quick translations will help them. Oh yeah, I got that. I now know what photosynthesis is because I know what that is in Korean. So just quick translations can be really, really powerful. Comparative language analysis is something that I love doing even with like 5-year-olds. Obviously, I don't teach them the meta language here, but like, you know, how do you say this in Mandarin? How do you say the same thing in Korean? And then them teaching each other, or even just them recognizing that, oh, actually, maybe that's an action in one language and the noun in another language. That's a really, really powerful skill. And the you know, the further along they are in their learning, the older they are, the more they can actually look at language samples and make those comparisons that then help them maybe with like syntax or, you know, making better choices of vocabulary when they are writing in English, if they have more understanding of the composition of the language or all of the languages that they speak. Plus, really, if we think about, you know, those of us who are competent speakers of more than one language, and for me, really, that's only two. So, you know, I'm not claiming to be like a super successful multilingual here, but the skill of being able to translate or to mediate from one language to another is a really complex thought process. So if we can support children and people of all ages, really, with building that skill, that translanguaging skill, it is going to strengthen the neural pathways, which will help them be better at all of their languages.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of people agreeing with you here in the chat here, Adri, about the comparison. What has come up and is a question that's often asked is, but how do you sort of balance that? You know, are we saying that anyone can use their languages at any time, or you know, is English still the main language? I mean, how might we as teachers sort of help balance that? And I'll open up to Yiviri or Adri.
Yiviri, do you want to take that first?
All right. Yeah, so I think one of the key issues that often come up when we talk about integrating multilingual approaches in the classroom is how much of the other language do we bring in? And then people would say, okay, judicious use of the other languages. And maybe another question would be, how much is judicious? Right. But the key thing is for the teacher to really make informed decisions on when the learners really need the support using the other languages. Sometimes as teachers, sometimes you have a program to cover. Remember that you're there, the administration is there and they're waiting for you. You have a scheme of work, you have a syllabus that you need to cover. And then you're teaching, like Adrienn talked earlier about using translation as a tool for mediation. We have some elements in vocabulary teaching, for example, that are so abstract, or maybe we have some culturally nuanced concepts that are so difficult to explain using the English language. And so if you've tried to do this in English and it doesn't work, I think it's just okay for the teacher to bring another language as a tool to mediate and also save time so you can move on with your program. I'm thinking about maybe an idiomatic expression. For example, you want to say, like it's been raining, not so much rain this morning here in Birmingham, but you want to use an idiomatic expression like it rained cats and dogs, right, in your classroom. And it's just so difficult for me to explain this to my learners who are better speakers of French. It could be really easier for me to just say that in French, and then the learners can understand. In French, I think they would say il pleut les cordes. So in English, they're using different images. We're using the image of cats and dogs, to express the intensity of the rain. But in French, they're using the image of a rope. You see, they are quite different. So we have these cultural nuances that would be difficult for students to pick up the idea. And so using translation as a tool to mediate students' understanding in this case, I think it's very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. You mentioned idioms, and actually that's something Natasha had mentioned in the chat there about using it's good when you're comparing in idioms is a good one to really identify and make, because when we talk about translation, we're not talking about literal, are we? We're talking about concepts that exist in both languages, and that those concepts are just expressed in different ways, and so that's where you can get that connection and also unpicking the cultural background behind it, as you mentioned as well, Yiviri.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, how about yourself, Adrienn? Anything else to add on that one?
So I think it also really depends on what your school accepts, right? So I think a lot of people are probably saying in the chat that, what's judicious use can vary to a great extent, even within the same country, right? In an ideal world, yes, children. Sorry, I keep coming back to children. I know not all of the teachers here today are teachers of children, but yeah, in an ideal world, people would be allowed to just rely on whatever language they can to express a point. But then ultimately, when we are English language teachers, the output that we should be aiming towards needs to be in English. So I think it becomes part of classroom management, and this is how we certainly deal with this in school, that the expectations need to be made clear to the learners about what their home languages should be or could be used for at different times of the lessons or the school day. Obviously, encouraging them to use the language of English for the purpose of creating the output, but then it's also the responsibility of the teacher to plan in time in that lesson so that the learner can rely on the languages that they feel more confident in, and to give them time to actually process all of that language so that they can get to a better output really in English. Because I think what I sometimes miss in my eagerness to get to the point of like, let's do this in English, is that if I can just hold on just a little bit longer, just give them a little bit of time to actually go through all of that cognitive process of thinking through something in their different languages, and then give them a little bit more time, hopefully with like peer support or teacher support, to get to the point where they can actually express the same thought in English, we'll get to depth that we wouldn't get to otherwise.
Thank you. Yes, I was having a look through some of the questions that are coming through, and one of on around the balancing and the idea of judicious use and how much we should use within the classroom, which I think we spoke about there with judicious. And as you rightly say, Yiviri, it's about making informed decisions. And there's also quite a few questions coming through about how do I do this? And so, what do you feel then is perhaps needed for teachers to support them with using multilingual approaches? What can people do to help them?
And Kim, I'm not sure I got that well. Yeah. Can you take that again?
There's a lot of people asking, how do I do this? How do I use multilingual approaches in the classroom? And you've given us some ideas there. Is there something else that people can do in their context? Is it dependent on something? Is there training available? Like, is it because there's not enough training? I mean, what have you found in your experiences?
Yeah. I do think that there is need for more training. However, the British Council does have a wonderful course on that is free.
I will talk about that in a moment. Don't worry.
Yes, I think that's a great place to start, and there are other training courses out there that are available. However, there is a need for more training around this because our world is changing, and education needs to change with it. I do think step one, it will sound a lot easier than it is done, but it's the jump right in and try and see how that goes. Now, I understand that in some schools, you might need permission to do this. Obviously, talk to the people that you need to talk to, but don't be afraid to try and get feedback from the stakeholders and start with your students. How did that feel? And while there is a need for training, all those years ago when I did my teacher training course, I did experiment with community language learning, which does bring in an element of using home languages for the support of learning English in the classroom. And I actually had to do that because I had really strong feelings around the don't use home languages. So that's how I started out about 15 years ago. And it was just a very interesting experience of going through that, and especially asking my students about how they felt made me feel like, well, actually, maybe I should do this more. And then there is also that element of just, start like baby steps. Do one thing, see how that works, get a little bit of feedback before, maybe thinking about multilingual approaches is too big, especially if you are working in a context that is English only at the moment. So just start with small little things like, bilingual, multilingual glossaries or displays around your classroom, and then see how that evolves and see where that takes you. You don't have to necessarily go all the way to translanguaging right away.
And I think, as we've sort of highlighted, saying that it's actually the fact that they're not excluded or ignored is the key thing. It's about making learners feel that their languages are valued, as you were highlighting there earlier, Viri. They are valued, their linguistic identities. They don't leave them at the door, I think you said, wasn't it? And so it's about giving them that space and being interested, finding out about what they are. Do a survey. What languages do we know? How did we learn them? And bringing in those conversations, isn't it? I think is really key. And there's sort of questions. I think another one is beliefs, isn't it? We've mentioned obviously moving from the background of immersive language learning, target language only, as being a sort of the most effective approach. But of course, there's so much evidence now for bringing in other languages. And so is that quite a barrier? Perhaps you can tell us in the chat, is this a barrier for yourselves, as perhaps your teachers, your learners within your context? Is that something that is quite difficult to manage, perhaps? How about yourselves? Have you come across or had to sort of help people shift their beliefs in your context?
I think I'm one of those teachers, and it took some time for me, despite my background in language learning, like I said earlier, where we really had to just learn in English, and it was quite frustrating. But during my teacher training program, it was very clear that you do not use any other language in the classroom apart from English. And I was very intentional about that. And my first years in teaching, I wouldn't use any other language in class. And I would be proud to tell my students that I cannot teach you English and use another language to help you understand English. You need to think in English. You need to use just the English language. And those were my first years of teaching. But as I grew into teaching, I began to shift, because whether we like it or not, translanguaging, for example, is a naturally occurring phenomenon in language learning. That our students would always come to us, Madam, can you say this in French? Please, how do we say this in this language? These things happen naturally. And when we restrict students to bring those languages in the classroom, it is frustrating. And then talking about beliefs, I just talked about my own experience. We need teacher agency. Teachers need to take up the responsibility to take decisions that help their learners to learn better. And Adrienn was talking about policies varying from country to country or from state to state, even within countries. Most also there are still many contexts, especially in the global south, where we have just the monolingual policy or English only policy. Then the truth is that most teachers do transgress these monolingual policies because they find multilingualism as, or the use of other languages as, an important resource, for learners. It is not a barrier. Maybe it could be a barrier if the teacher misuses it. And of course, that is where the training we are talking about comes in, for teachers to be supported, because most of the times, as research has shown, teachers navigate multiple languages in their classes unsupported. They do it on their own in the best ways they can do it. And some of them, when they want to use it, I would use the term smuggle. They smuggle the other languages into their classroom because they are afraid that the administration would see them use another language, and they may be asked to justify or explain why. So they don't do it freely, and when it is smuggling, they don't give the best of themselves. So we need this aspect of the shift. We really need that shift from the policymakers, and then teachers to need to have the responsibility of, changing their mindset and taking the responsibility to say, this is what my learners need. Although the policy doesn't agree that, but can do this to support my learners, and then bring evidence, because teachers are the ones in the classrooms. Policy makers are sometimes people who have been out of the classroom for 10-20 years, and they have no idea what is happening in the classroom. So it is a responsibility of the teacher to do what is right, and then bring evidence to the policy makers so they can align the policies with real classroom practices.
Yeah, absolutely. It's convinced, and it is really important, isn't it, to have those in place, to feel that you've given agency and you're encouraged to use languages, not penalised or for using them, which has happened in the past, and I think probably still continues to happen, as I'm seeing in some of the comments in the chat there. And
to say that, I'm sorry, Kim, to say that agency is not given. No one would really give you agency. You really need to take that on your own as a teacher and create the impact that you need in your learners' learning journeys.
Absolutely. I think yes, in terms of sort of organizational practices or approaches, and that's what you mentioned about having the sort of policies in and approaches that you're encouraged to use languages in your classroom. And I see we have Amol. Hello, Amol. Thank you for joining us. You've come in for question time. Fantastic. Would you like to sort of just say hello and
yeah, a very warm hello and greeting to everyone, and my genuine apologies. As you can see, we had a major breakdown, so I had to abandon my laptop, my home, and I'm out in the wild in search of good network. Here it is. So thanks for patience. Yeah.
Oh, well, it's lovely. You look outside in the trees there. A bit jealous. Very nice. And so actually, Amol, I'll come to you. So as our sort of final question to the panel, we've been talking obviously about multilingual practices, multilingualism. We can't really forget the topic of technology and particularly AI at this time. And so what does technology, I guess particularly AI, seem to offer for sort of multilingualism in education?
I think an important challenge for us is to reconceptualize, reimagine our conventional notions of multilingualism and multilingual practices, because I guess in another 5 years, the scenario will be radically different. For example, typically the burden is on the teacher to exploit multilingual resources of the learners. And in order to exploit them, the teacher has to be aware of many things. Now, AI offers a wonderful opportunity which takes away all that burden from the teacher. And students, it puts tools and means in the hands of learners. They're already in the hands of learners. So I think any forward-looking Minister of Education or Board of Education would not invest in multilingual textbooks. Rather than spending money on having same textbooks in multiple languages, they would rather introduce lots of multilingual tools, make them available to learners, and the learners would be making use of all the single language, monolanguage material available to them on their own. So this is one important thing. And second important thing is within the classroom, even if there are multiple languages spoken, usually we find that there are just one or two operational languages. And more or less, teachers and students have to accommodate themselves to those operational languages. That limitation is going to go away significantly thanks to AI and technology. So I think in future, maybe in just another 5 years, we will rather have tools looking at monolingual materials rather than bringing multilingual materials and practice into the classroom itself. That's my understanding.
It's a really good point you make about the materials, because actually that was a comment I saw earlier in the chat, question around the fact that we're working with sort of course books, course materials that are not set up for multilingual approaches necessarily, and obviously the AI and technology can support with that. So that's a really, really, really good point for us to consider. So we are coming up to question time, and before we go to questions, we had mentioned about Adrienn mentioned the course that we have on teaching English, the one that's coming up. So there's quite a few of you asking about what do I do in the classroom? How do I do that? How do I use it with monolingual or multilingual classes? And so there is this free multilingual practices, English in the multilingual classroom, sorry. It's to sign up, you first need to register with an account on Teaching English. So the course is online and self-paced, so you can do it whenever you have time. There's 3 modules and you have it until December to complete it. So hopefully that's going to support or answer some of those questions that we've come through about the specifics of why and how, and perhaps help you think about your own beliefs and preferences in this area. So that's the course there. That's starting now, soon. So do go on and sign up for that. But we also have a professional development pathway of resources linked to multilingual practices. So for example, there's videos, articles, webinar recordings, all sort of aimed at supporting you and training and developing, as we were saying earlier, a teacher in this area. So I hope they will be useful for you. Has anyone taken the course previously? Or is there one of the courses or the pathways you'd be interested in? Tell us in the comments. Have you taken the course? Are you interested in the course? Fantastic. Thank you. And so thank you ever so much for all of you joining. So we're going to go to a couple of questions now. We've got a little bit of time to take some questions. So there was one from, oops, I say that. We've got one here about challenging mindset. So that's right. There's a lot of ones here, and that's I think some of them we've already answered, which is great. But oh, that's right. There was one thing around there was a couple of questions around the terminology. So Adrienn, you mentioned translanguaging, and there's a couple of questions here that talk about code switching, which is obviously 2 terms related to multilingual practices. So perhaps, Adrienn, would you like to give us a little overview of how you see translanguaging? And then I'm not sure if Yiviri or Amol, you could give us a little bit more input on what code switching is.
Okay, first of all, I'm no authority on this, and I can only talk about it from my context. And the way I understand translanguaging is that pedagogical translanguaging is that there are you can think about it in roughly 2 ways. Is it planned or is it unplanned? If it's planned, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's teacher-led, but that you almost build it into your classroom practice or build it into your lesson planning process as support for the learners. If it's unplanned, it's almost like working with emergent language, but the languages that you're working with aren't all English, all at the same time. And the way that both of those feed into the teaching English bit is that how is that access to the home languages, how's the access to the home languages or the other languages then supports the output that then is in English. And then it can almost be like a support system for the learners. So are they using their other languages to support them when they feel the need that they should or could have access to that? And is the teacher using the access to home languages as a pedagogic tool towards the objective of the lesson?
Thank you. Yes, and there's a lot of reading out there on translanguaging, isn't there?
Yes,
It's a very trending term. And as you said, it's quite difficult to pin down because it's almost a bit of an umbrella term, if you like, that sort of covers a lot of sort of linguistic inclusive pedagogy and using languages and code switching, which has come up there, is one part of that. Would anyone like to take on an explanation of code switching?
I think I can go with that. I cannot talk about code switching without talking about translanguaging. So I'll have to come back to some of the things that Adrienn has already mentioned. But I think the difference between translanguaging and code switching depends on the way we conceptualize language. Now, think about it this way. Instead of looking at a multilingual language learner as someone having boxes in their brains with different languages, so you have a box that contains English, box that contains French, Spanish, German, the languages that you speak. So the languages, from the perspective of code switching, are arranged in a learner's brain in boxes. They are separated, right? But with translanguaging sees these languages as belonging to one large unified box or a system. And so the multilingual learner does not have to worry from which box they want to select each tool from that toolbox that they want to use. So they just have one large language tool where they language box where they select words from in their to satisfy their linguistic demand. So in code switching, the learner is moving from box to box, picking languages from different boxes that they have in their brains. But in translanguaging, we have this fluid use of languages because the languages are found in one space, in one box. So you just move, you could start, a learner could start a sentence in English, for example, and then the next word that comes is in French. So it's just fluid, it just moves, like that. So and it's something that happened. It's a question that always comes up when we're talking about multilingualism, because people want to understand are they switching from one language to another, or they are just using the languages the way they are arranged. So the difference between these two would really just depend on how you conceptualize your language. If you feel that the languages are just a unified language system, then you are translanguaging. But if it is code switching, it means that we have different code systems in our brain, and then you need to move from one code to another in order to code switch.
It is. There's a lot. Thank you. It's always hard to go to different technology. And as you mentioned there, though, the whole point about languages not being stored separate in the brain was a big thing by Cummins, obviously, with the underlying theory where, if you think in one language, it's separate, and that's the interference, which is now obviously being sort of dismissed by a lot of researchers in there. So. Amol, I'm going to come back to you actually on the digital, because we've had a couple of questions around from Teresita. That one there about, you mentioned how it can support sort of multilingualism, multilingual practices. And they were just after a couple more examples of particular tools that you would recommend or ways in which they can use digital resources in the classroom?
I don't have any ready recommendations, but I can suggest where and how the tools might be more productive and more useful. So, for example, the teacher might continue to teach monolingually. And this has happened in my own classrooms. So I would completely teach in English. These are, of course, undergraduate students. But I saw all of them working with their mobiles, trying to figure out what I was talking about, especially some keywords or some concepts in their respective languages. I had nearly 21 languages spoken in my classroom, and they were all working. Now, when I suggested if I could use a language that was common to at least half of the people, they said that they were interested in developing their English. So they were fine with the teacher carrying on in English, while they had tools in their hand on their mobiles to help themselves whenever there was a problem. So all kinds of translation tools, all kinds of explanatory tools, all kinds of tools that help understand the stylistic differences, and there are lots and lots of them. So these are the tools which are really handy for the learners. And as a teacher, I don't have to carry the burden of remembering which language is spoken by whom and what I can do in that language and what if I don't know. All those questions have become redundant in my classroom. But can I make a quick comment about translanguaging and code switching? Just 10 seconds. To the person who asked about the difference between code switching and translanguaging, I would say you are not alone. As a teacher, practicing teacher, I haven't found any convincing difference between the two notions, though there are theoretical, or as Yiviri put it more properly, conceptual models, which only try to give different views of the same thing. We don't know for real whether our brain has separate boxes or one large box. And whether we know or not, as a teacher in the classroom, I don't get any useful, practical advantage in making distinctions between translanguaging and code switching. I'm still struggling to find some, but haven't managed to find yet. So
Nice one.
No,
Nice
you're
one.
absolutely right. And I think it just sort of highlights really how, rich and extensive and complex and exciting this whole area is. And there's so many sort of things, there's so much research and training and theory that's around this, which if you are looking, when we're looking at as teachers perhaps coming to this for the first time, it's really useful to read through those and think about your beliefs and explore the theories behind it and understand that, as we do anyway as teachers. I think I mentioned on there, we always reflect on our practice, we look at what's new approaches, we find out what works. And so I think that's all we've got time for at the moment. I know there was a few other questions there. As I said, hopefully the courses and the articles, I'd recommend checking those out on the Teaching English website to find out more. And of course, thanks. Of course, we've got our session coming up today as well, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But I'd just like to say, thank you very much to Amol, Adrienn, Yiviri for joining us today, and of course our moderators on Zoom and Facebook, and obviously a big thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. So we'll be back in 15 minutes for the next session, which is about classroom management in multilingual classes with a teacher from Myanmar. And so see you then.